I'm from, the credibility I have. I've been in prison. Growing up where I grew up at, prison is, that's where you're going. And we look to go to prison. And it's kind of like, gives you a stripe, gives you some credibility. And so because I have that, I can talk to boys, get their ear, and then take them away from it. You know, take them away from the path they're on, put them on a good path. And so I really was, I still want to do that. If I ever had a chance, I'm gonna do that. And so I just think that's what young boys need. They don't have fathers out there. They don't have brothers. Single parent houses, I think they need a man to talk to. Somebody that's gonna, take them to play chess, take them to play basketball, buy them some new shoes when they need some new shoes, take some distress off the mother too, right? So, yeah.
A convenience store owner lay bleeding on his shop floor, shot dead by a 20-year-old who walked in with lies festering in his head. The killer's name was Christopher Young, and what happened next would challenge everything America believes about justice, redemption, and second chances. November 21, 2004. San Antonio's East Side. One bullet. One life ended. One life forever changed. But here's where this story gets complicated. 14 years later, the dead man's family would stand before television cameras and beg the state of Texas not to execute his killer. Faith leaders would rally in the city's main plaza. A victim's son would join hands with the murderer's aunt, pleading for mercy. Why? Because Christopher Young had done something unprecedented on death row. Something that would make hardened prosecutors pause. Something that would split a community down the middle and force a nation to ask an impossible question. The statistics are brutal. Texas has executed over 570 people since 1982. Less than 1% of those condemned killers ever receive clemency. The odds of survival on Texas death row? Virtually zero. Christopher Young knew these numbers when he filed his final appeals. He knew them when he penned his last letters. He knew them when he made a claim that would echo through courtrooms and controversy for years to come. Was he a cold-blooded killer who deserved to die? Or had he become something else entirely behind prison walls? The answer would determine whether justice meant vengeance, or something far more complex. This is his story. November 21, 2004. 10:47 p.m. The mini food mart's fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune across San Antonio's east side. Behind the bulletproof glass, Hasmukh Patel counted the day's receipts. 53 years old. Father. Husband. A man who'd built his American dream one transaction at a time. Hash, as everyone called him, had worked 16-hour days for years to keep this small corner store alive. The neighborhood wasn't easy. The customers weren't always friendly. But Hash Patel was a survivor, an immigrant who'd turned a tiny convenience store into his family's lifeline. That he had no idea that 20 feet away in the parking lot's shadows, death was walking toward his front door. Christopher Anthony Young was 20 years old that night. Drunk. Angry. Carrying lies in his head that would soon turn deadly. What happened in the next few minutes would destroy two families forever and set in motion one of the most controversial death penalty cases in Texas history. The security camera captured it all. Every second. Every movement. Every choice that led to tragedy. Hash Patel was closing his register when the door chimed. He looked up, probably expecting a late-night customer wanting cigarettes or beer. Instead, he saw a young man whose eyes held something dangerous. Something final. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, Hash Patel lay dying on the floor he'd mopped 1,000 times, his blood spreading across the linoleum like spilled paint. The cash register held maybe $200. A life's work reduced to scattered bills and loose change. Young fled into the night, leaving behind more than a body. He left behind a wife who'd become a widow, children who'd grow up fatherless, a community that would demand justice. But justice, in this case, would prove more complicated than anyone imagined. Because the young man who pulled that trigger, the same man who destroyed a family in 3 minutes of violence, would spend the next 14 years becoming someone entirely different. Someone who'd challenge everything we think we know about guilt, redemption, and whether a killer can truly change. The police sirens wailed through San Antonio streets that night, racing toward the mini food mart where Hash Patel had taken his last breath. They had no way of knowing they were responding to more than just another convenience store murder. They were racing toward a story that would divide a city, challenge a justice system, and ask an impossible question. when someone commits an unforgivable act, is forgiveness still possible? Patel died believing in the goodness of people, even the customers who sometimes gave him trouble, even the neighborhood kids who tested his patience. He died trusting that tomorrow would bring another chance to build something better. Christopher Young ran from that store carrying the weight of what he'd done. But he also carried something else, something that would grow during his years on death row into the most unexpected transformation in Texas criminal history. The security footage from that night would be played in courtrooms, analyzed by experts, and studied by journalists for years to come. Frame by frame, it told the story of 3 minutes that changed everything. But what the cameras couldn't capture was the aftermath, the ripple effects that would spread through 2 families, a community, and eventually force an entire state to confront its deepest beliefs about punishment and redemption. This is the story of that night. And everything that came after. Christopher Anthony Young was drowning long before he walked into that convenience store. 20 years old. 3 children with different mothers. A life spinning out of control in ways that would soon turn deadly. But what happened on November 21, 2004, began hours earlier with a lie that would cost Patel his life. Young had been drinking that evening when his baby's mother told him something that ignited a rage he couldn't contain. She claimed Patel had disrespected her, threatened her, done something that demanded retaliation. Every word was a fabrication. My baby's mother lied to me, Young would later admit from his prison cell, the weight of that deception hanging in his voice like smoke from a funeral pyre. I was drunk. We knew the victim. But before Young ever set foot in the mini food mart, before Patel became his target, another crime had already stained that November night. Earlier that evening, Young had sexually assaulted a woman in front of her 3 children. The details were brutal, unforgivable. The kind of violence that reveals something broken at the core. The woman managed to escape Young's grip and flee to safety. But Young wasn't finished. The alcohol in his system mixed with the lies in his head, creating a toxic combination that would soon prove lethal. He drove through San Antonio's east side streets, his mind fixated on the fabricated confrontation his baby's mother had described. Patel's name burned in his thoughts, a man he actually knew, a shopkeeper who'd served him countless times, now transformed into an enemy by whispered lies. The irony cuts deep. Young was heading to confront a man over a dispute that never happened, carrying rage meant for crimes that were never committed. At 10:47 p.m., Young parked outside the mini food mart. Through the windows he could see Patel behind the counter, finishing his nightly routine. A hard-working father closing up shop. A man who had no idea he was about to pay the ultimate price for someone else's deception. Young later described his state of mind that night in words that would haunt courtrooms and appeal hearings for years. The whole confrontation went wrong. For words that tried to explain the unexplainable. For words that could never bring Patel back to life. What drives a young man from assault to murder in a single evening? The question would echo through police interrogation rooms and legal proceedings, but the answer remained maddeningly simple. Lies, alcohol, and choices that cascade into tragedy. Young walked toward those glass doors carrying more than just misplaced anger. He carried the weight of bad decisions, broken relationships, and a life that had already spiraled beyond redemption. But he also carried something else, something that wouldn't reveal itself until years later, locked away on Texas death row. The security camera captured Young's approach that night. Frame by frame, it documented the final moments before 2 lives changed forever. But what the footage couldn't show was the complex web of deception that had brought him to Patel's door. In less than 3 minutes, Young would transform from troubled young father to cold-blooded killer. The transition was swift, violent, irreversible. But the man who would emerge from that store covered in another man's blood, carrying $200 in stolen cash, was about to begin a journey that would challenge everything Texas believed about justice and redemption. 10:47 p.m. The door chime echoed through the mini food mart like a death knell. Christopher Young stepped inside, his movements captured in grainy black and white by the security camera mounted above the cigarette display. Patel looked up from his register, probably expecting another late-night customer. Instead, he found himself staring into the eyes of his killer. What happened next lasted 2 minutes and 37 seconds, a span of time shorter than most television commercials, but long enough to destroy 2 families forever. Young approached the counter with purpose. The bulletproof glass that separated him from Patel suddenly seemed meaningless. Words were exchanged. Demands made. The robbery had begun, but something was already going wrong. Patel had survived in this neighborhood for years by reading people, by knowing when to comply and when to resist. But the young man standing before him that night was different. Unpredictable. Dangerous in ways that experience couldn't measure. The security footage shows Young pulling out a gun. Frame by frame, the grainy images captured the moment when a simple robbery transformed into something far more sinister. Patel's hands went up. He opened the register. He did everything a victim is supposed to do to survive. It wasn't enough. "I never meant to kill him," Young would later claim from his prison cell, the words carrying the weight of a confession that changed nothing and explained everything. The gunshot echoed through the store at 10:49 p.m. A single bullet. Center mass. Patel collapsed behind the counter, his blood spreading across the floor where he'd stood for thousands of ordinary transactions. Young grabbed the money from the open register, roughly $200 in bills and loose change. The cost of Patel's life, reduced to pocket money. He stepped over the dying man and walked out into the San Antonio night, leaving behind a crime scene that would haunt investigators for years. But security cameras don't lie, and neither does ballistics evidence. The investigation moved swiftly through San Antonio's east side. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the footage that captured every second of the murder. Young's face was clearly visible on camera. His fingerprints were found on the counter. The weapon was recovered from a location he'd frequented. Within 72 hours, Christopher Anthony Young was in custody. The arrest was routine. No dramatic chase. No shootout with police. Just a 20-year-old man who'd run out of places to hide, sitting in an interrogation room where the weight of his choices finally caught up with him. Young's confession came in pieces. First he admitted to being at the store. Then to the robbery. Finally to pulling the trigger that ended Patel's life. Each admission drove another nail into his legal coffin, building a case that prosecutors would later call airtight. The evidence was overwhelming. The motive was clear. The defendant had confessed. In the sterile language of legal proceedings, People versus Christopher Anthony Young appeared to be an open and shut case. But the story was just beginning. Because while Young sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, something was already stirring, something that would eventually transform this straightforward murder case into one of the most controversial death penalty battles in Texas history. Patel's family was grieving. The community was demanding justice. And Christopher Young was about to discover that some journeys begin at their darkest moment. The security footage from that November night would be played countless times in courtrooms and appeals hearings. But what it couldn't capture was the transformation that was already beginning, a change that would challenge everything Texas believed about guilt, punishment, and the possibility of redemption. The gavel fell with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Christopher Young sat motionless as the jury foreman delivered the verdict that would seal his fate. Guilty of capital murder during the commission of a robbery. 12 citizens had deliberated for less than 4 hours, barely enough time to review the security footage that captured Patel's final moments. The prosecution's case was surgical in its precision. They presented the videotape evidence frame by frame, Young's own confession word by word, the ballistics report that matched the murder weapon to the fatal bullet. District Attorney Susan Reed painted a picture of cold-blooded execution disguised as robbery. But trials have two phases in death penalty cases, and the second would determine whether Young lived or died. The sentencing phase lasted 3 days. Prosecutors argued that Young posed a continuing threat to society, pointing to the sexual assault he'd committed hours before the murder. The defense pleaded for life, highlighting Young's youth and troubled background. The jury needed just 2 hours to decide. Death by lethal injection. Judge Mary Roman pronounced the sentence with clinical detachment. Christopher Anthony Young, you are hereby sentenced to death for the capital murder of Hasmukh Patel. Young showed no emotion as the words echoed through the courtroom, but something was already stirring behind his impassive expression, something that would emerge during his years on death row. On arrival at the Pulaski unit, Young became Texas death row inmate number 999508. The number seemed insignificant then, but it would later become a symbol of one of the most controversial clemency campaigns in state history. His cell measured 6 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls. Steel bars. A narrow window that offered glimpses of sky. For most condemned prisoners, this becomes their entire universe until the day they die. But Young was about to begin a journey that would transform not just himself, but everyone who encountered his story. The 14-year countdown had begun. 14 years of appeals. 14 years of waiting. 14 years that would witness the most unlikely transformation in Texas death row history. What Young didn't know as those prison doors clanged shut was that his real trial was just beginning, not in courtrooms or appeals courts, but in the quiet hours of solitary confinement where a killer would slowly become something else entirely. Something impossible was happening in cell #999508. Christopher Young, killer, rapist, destroyer of families, was becoming someone else entirely. For 14 years, while lawyers filed appeals and courts scheduled execution dates, Young embarked on the most unlikely journey in Texas death row history. Redemption from within a concrete tomb. It began with his aunt's church in San Antonio. Young started corresponding with youth groups, writing letters that transformed from pleas for forgiveness into powerful testimonials about choices and consequences. Week after week, month after month, year after year, he mentored teenagers who were walking the same dangerous path he'd taken. The letters multiplied. Phone calls followed. Soon, Young was counseling dozens of at-risk youth from his death row cell, sharing his story as a cautionary tale while offering hope for different outcomes. "The only way to triumph over death is to make your life a masterpiece," Young wrote to one troubled teenager in 2012, his words carrying the weight of a man facing his own mortality. The transformation wasn't performance. It wasn't calculated for appeals courts or clemency boards. Prison officials noted Young's genuine remorse, his consistent behavior, his dedication to turning his cell into a classroom for kids who needed to hear his message. But here's the paradox that would later divide Texas. Can a man truly change while awaiting execution for an unforgivable crime? Young was mentoring children while preparing to die for killing their neighbor. He was offering hope while living under a death sentence. He was becoming a force for good while paying for ultimate evil. The young man who'd walked into Patel's store driven by lies and alcohol was gone. In his place sat someone who understood the devastating ripple effects of violence not just on victims, but on families, communities, and the killers themselves. Church leaders began visiting. Youth pastors brought troubled teens to hear Young's story through prison phone systems. Letters poured in from young people who credited Young's mentorship with saving their lives. For 14 years, this contradiction played out in cell number 999508. A condemned man living more purposefully than most free citizens, a killer who'd become a lifesaver, a death row inmate who was more alive than he'd ever been. But transformation doesn't erase the past, and redemption doesn't resurrect the dead. Patel was still gone. His family still grieved. Justice still demanded its price. And Christopher Young's execution date was still approaching with the inevitability of sunrise. The question haunting everyone who encountered his story remained unanswered. When someone commits the unforgivable, can they ever truly be forgiven? The impossible was happening in San Antonio's main plaza. A murdered man's family was begging Texas to spare his killer's life. Patel's son stood beside Christopher Young's aunt, their voices unified in a plea that shattered every assumption about justice, vengeance, and forgiveness. Faith leaders surrounded them, holding signs that read, "Mercy" and "Redemption." The scene was unprecedented in Texas death penalty history. The Patel family had watched Young's transformation for 14 years. They'd seen the letters he wrote to troubled youth. They'd witnessed the lives he'd saved from behind bars. They'd heard the genuine remorse in his voice during prison phone calls. And they'd made a decision that stunned a state known for its unwavering support of capital punishment. "That we believe Chris has changed," Patel's son told reporters, his words carrying the weight of unimaginable grace. "Killing him won't bring my father back." The clemency campaign drew support from an unlikely coalition: victims' rights advocates, youth ministers, death penalty opponents, and community leaders who'd seen Young's mentorship work firsthand. Letters poured into the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles from teenagers who credited Young with saving their lives. But Texas had granted clemency to only 3 death row inmates since 1976. Young filed his final appeals claiming racial bias in the clemency process, arguing that the board's composition and procedures systematically disadvantaged minority defendants. His lawsuit challenged decades of precedent, forcing courts to examine whether equal justice extended to the death chamber door. The board's decision came swift and final. Clemency denied. Young's execution was scheduled for July 17, 2018. The news hit the coalition of supporters like a physical blow. Patel's family had done something extraordinary. They'd forgiven their father's killer and fought to save his life. But forgiveness, they learned, doesn't always translate to mercy in the Texas justice system. The legal challenges continued right up to Young's final day, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Texas had executed over 560 people since reinstating capital punishment, and Christopher Young appeared destined to become number 561. Yet something had fundamentally changed in San Antonio. A victim's family had chosen grace over vengeance. A community had rallied around redemption. A condemned man had touched more lives from death row than he ever had as a free citizen. The question now wasn't whether Young deserved to die. The courts had settled that 14 years earlier. The question was whether a transformed man should pay for the crimes of who he used to be. July 17, 2018. 6:30 p.m. Christopher Young walked into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit carrying 14 years of transformation and the weight of one unforgivable night. At 34 years old, he was about to become the 10th person executed in Texas that year. The gurney awaited. IVs inserted. Witnesses gathered behind glass, including representatives from both families whose lives he'd forever altered. Young's final words echoed through the sterile chamber with the clarity of a man who'd found his purpose too late. "I want to make sure the Patel family knows I love them like they love me. Make sure the kids in the world know I'm being executed and those kids I've been mentoring keep this fight going." At 6:38 p.m., the lethal injection began. Pentobarbital flowed through the tubes connected to Young's arms. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. 8 minutes later, at 6:46 p.m., Christopher Anthony Young was pronounced dead. But his story didn't end with that final breath. The teenagers Young had mentored from death row continued writing letters, sharing his lessons, fighting the battles he'd taught them to win. His transformation had rippled outward, touching lives that would touch other lives, creating a legacy that transcended the crimes that put him on death row. Patel's family grieved twice that day, once for their father, whose absence would never stop aching, and once for the man his killer had become. Their forgiveness hadn't saved Young's life, but it had saved their souls from the poison of perpetual hatred. The questions Young's case raised refused to die with him. Can true redemption exist within walls designed for punishment? What happens when victims' families choose mercy over vengeance? Did 14 years of genuine transformation matter more than 3 minutes of violence? Texas had executed a mentor. A changed man. Someone who'd become more valuable to society locked in a cell than he'd ever been walking free streets. The paradox cuts both ways. Justice was served, but was mercy denied? Christopher Young's execution didn't answer these questions, it made them more urgent. His story forces America to confront uncomfortable truths about punishment, redemption, and the possibility that our justice system might sometimes execute the very people who've learned how to save others from following their path. The debate continues in courtrooms and classrooms, in churches and community centers where Young's letters still inspire troubled youth to choose different endings to their stories. Some transformations survive even death itself.